Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to participants from all over the world. On behalf of the Lutheran World Federation, the World Council of Churches, and the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland, I would like to welcome all of you to this public webinar on Women and Interfaith Engagement, sharing lessons learned during the COVID-19 and beyond. I'm Reverend Dr. Sivin Kit, Program Executive for Public Theology and Interreligious Relations from the Lutheran World Federation. I'm very happy to moderate today's interfaith conversation. And now, to enable us to fully participate in this current webinar, I would like to invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat box, because that is the place where we will interact with you. As long as you're comfortable, you can introduce yourself, give us your name, which organization you're part of, your position or the role that you play there, and also which country are you signing in from, you're participating from. Now, you may also use the chat box to ask any questions later and even respond and give your reactions with your comments during the course of this webinar. Now, this webinar will be recorded and we will make the recording available once it's ready online after this. Now, for documentation of this webinar, so that we can benefit from the learning and the insights, we will follow the Chatham House rules in relation to our discussions in the chat box. So we would like this to be a safe space for participants to also engage with one another. Now, with this introduction and some technical aspects cleared, I would like to invite Reverend Dr. Peniel Rajkumar, Program Coordinator for Interreligious Dialogue and Cooperation from the World Council of Churches, to give us some opening remarks and also to frame our conversation for today. So I would like to pass the time to Peniel. Over to you.
Thank you, Sivin. Dear brothers and sisters, it is a joy for the WCC to be co-hosting this webinar on women and interfaith engagement, sharing lessons learned during COVID-19 and beyond, alongside our counterparts, the Lutheran World Federation and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Finland. This takes on a special significance as we commemorate Interfaith Harmony Week today. The current COVID-19 pandemic has bound us as human beings in a shared vulnerability and has highlighted the importance of interreligious solidarity at a time such as this. It has helped us in some ways to recognize that crucial to our well-being is also what I would call our interbeing, our interrelatedness, through which we seek the flourishing of all. And it is to explore how we, as people of faith and goodwill, can contribute to a common flourishing through interreligious solidarity that this webinar has been planned and organized. Its distinctiveness, however, lies in approaching the question of interreligious engagement and solidarity from the perspective of women, and also on focusing not just on a world wounded by COVID-19, but also by many other pandemics. In some ways, as the organizers, we have taken seriously the recent policy brief by the UN Secretary General, Dr. Antonio Guterres, who highlights how responding to the COVID-19 pandemic is not just about rectifying long-standing inequalities, but also about building a resilient world, putting women's leadership and contributions at the heart of resilience and recovery. And therefore, this webinar today attempts to connect the dots, so to speak, the dots between faith, women, and effective responses to COVID-19. At the same time, it also looks beyond. It highlights how women, through their interreligious engagement, have been long-standing agents of hope, hospitality, and healing in a wounded world. We are here to learn from our panelists as to how and what they have found to be stumbling blocks and stepping stones in their own journeys towards just, inclusive, and holistic communities. Dear brothers and sisters, we live in a context where interreligious engagement is often accused of being elitist. One of the images that I personally have come across that is often used to describe such elitism, that restrains dialogue to the theoretical level without enabling it to trickle down to the practical level, is the picture of dialogue as taking place on the top floor of a high-rise building, while on the ground floor, a fire is raging out of control. This webinar also seeks to address this gap, the gap between theory and practice, by learning from the experiences of practitioners of dialogue, who have, through their own life and practice, in some ways been able to reimagine dialogue as a dialogue of and for life. And it is our hope as the organizers that this webinar will deepen our imagination, broaden our partnerships, and strengthen our collective moral resolve to build a world of justice and equality marked by healing and hope. With these words, let me welcome each one of you to this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peniel, for these very important words to frame our conversation together. And we really look forward to hear from our panel of speakers. So thank you once again, Peniel. Now, for today, we have decided to use a conversational approach to our webinar. So rather than focus on like giving long presentations, and we know that our speakers come from different religious backgrounds, and we look forward, and also professional locations, and they will enable us to have really interesting insights from those variety of perspectives. Now, after a brief introduction, each speaker will speak for about 3 to 4 minutes, their own introductory remarks, and we'll then follow with a free flow conversation. And I'd like to invite the participants to engage with us in the chat. And if you want to just send a direct question to the panelists, then you send all panelists, just the panelists. But if you don't mind and you feel that a question will be helpful for everyone, you can actually just send to all panelists and attendees, and that includes your comments as well. So then I will help to moderate it and to engage in a conversation with our 3 panelists. Now, over the past years, we have seen really encouraging signs of people's solidarity with their neighbors, especially the most needy, through volunteer groups, support networks, charitable activities, theological conversations, interfaith dialogue. And yet, the significant contribution of perspectives of women in interfaith engagement and interreligious collaboration to address all of this has really received very insufficient attention, even though there's more now, and we are happy to have that. So I will introduce our speakers, and they will start off by just addressing an opening question. Why do you think, or why do they think, the perspectives of women is important for interfaith dialogue and engagement? And what has been one key insight that they have learned in the course of their experience and their engagement? Now, the first speaker is Dr. Debbie Weissman. And we have agreed more or less everyone that we'll just go with our first name basis so that this is a friendly conversation. Now, she is an amazing trailblazer in many ways, former president of the International Council of Christians and Jews. And she's the first Jewish woman and the only second woman, as far as I know, at all, to have served in that position in well over 50 years. She's a retired Jewish educator, and she has shared her experiences in a book entitled Memoirs of a Hopeful Pessimist, A Life of Activism Through Dialogue. So Debbie, I'd like to pass the time over to you to just have some opening remarks. Over to you, Debbie.
Thank you very much. Thank you. One thing I will add is that I live in Jerusalem, and I'm speaking to you now from my home in Jerusalem. And I want to apologize for my hair. We're under lockdown. We can't go for a haircut. And so under normal circumstances, it wouldn't be this messy, I hope. Anyway, we have all lived through the last year or so in which our common humanity has given us, I would say, both positive insights and some negative experiences. And that's really what being a human being is about. And when we use the term human being, sometimes we say, oh, well, he's only human. Or we might say, oh, she's a real human being. Or as we say in German and in Yiddish, a real Mensch. So human being can be both a kind of a put down as well as a compliment. And what we've seen now would be both the vulnerability of human beings as well as our resilience. And I think that goes across the board. So now if I'm focusing on women specifically, I think that a number of countries that have been led by women have actually done somewhat better in fighting the pandemic. And this seems to be true in the United States for some of the states that are governed by women. I'm not sure why that is, but I will make a suggestion. Some people have said that it's motherhood that gives women the advantage. But, you know, not all women have the experience of motherhood. I, for example, am not a mother. I'm a very involved aunt and great aunt, but I'm not a mother. And I would prefer to suggest that it's because women have been marginalized in our own cultures and faith communities. And so maybe we have developed a certain kind of empathy or identification with others who are similarly marginalized in our societies and around the world, and maybe a special kind of resilience. So I'm just going to add, first of all, I want to thank you very much for mentioning the title of my book. I appreciate that. And the book really goes into, I would say, not only some of the challenges of living here in the Middle East and specifically in Israel, but also my struggle as a feminist within the Orthodox Jewish community. And I have learned a great deal from my contacts with Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, Sikh, and other feminists from around the world. And also, of course, the experience of interreligious dialogue, which I think has been tremendously enriching and enlightening.
Thank you, Debbie. And we are looking forward to hear more from you afterwards. And the next person that I would like to invite to come forward is Dr. Gaya. And let me introduce her a little bit to you, Dr. Gaia Gam Herger. She's a medical doctor and public health expert with 3 decades of experience in the public health sector. And she has worked with the WHO, the World Health Organization, for 19 years, mostly leading capacity building and initiatives for health emergencies, including COVID-19 trainings. And I'm sure in those contexts, definitely there'll be a lot of interaction with people of faith, as well as those who are from a more secular persuasion or other humanistic persuasions. She's currently the head of learning and capacity development of WHO. Emergencies program, and she also has a consultancy called the Wisdom House, and that's a very interesting work that she does too, bringing Buddhist insights into leadership. So I'd like to pass the time to you, Gaya. What is your perspective on this topic?
Thank you so much, Kit. It's really an honor to be with you and with these very distinguished speakers. I must say, I do not have the credentials they have, but I do have the same problem the previous speaker had. The pandemic helped me embrace my natural look. So I think I can list you 100 things that the pandemic destroyed. But one thing that is emerging is, beyond my superficiality of how I look, women are beginning to see themselves in a different way. So what have I learned? I've learned that real interaction with people outside your tribe, and I use this word very intentionally. I believe interreligious dialogue, interfaith dialogue that Reverend Rajkumar talked about is really what is human between all people. It's the humanness that we all share. But the way to do it is not just to talk like we do in public, but to live with people of other faiths. And I've really been fortunate. I grew up in Sri Lanka, where I was brought up in a Buddhist culture. I didn't really understand Buddhism, but I had the culture, and that shaped my value system. About kindness and compassion and discipline and not harming others. I spent my childhood in the United Kingdom, where I went to a school which was Christian. I attended assemblies, I read the Bible. Then I came back to Sri Lanka, went to China for nearly 10 years, where religion, faith was not discussed at all. And then I spent a number of years in a Muslim girls' school as well. And then in the World Health Organization, I see people of all faiths. And what has really helped me understand the connectedness of humanity, which is embodied by the topic here, Interfaith Dialogue, is really that experience of getting to know people and understanding that we're far more similar than we are different. So I don't really consider myself a religious person, but I definitely consider myself a woman of faith. And just shifting to COVID, even before COVID, if you take the topic of women of faith, women compose slightly more than half of humanity. And we have lived for centuries, for millennia, where women have been treated differently from men. And as the previous speaker said, it is probably being the underdog in society, although you are actually numerically the majority, being the underdog allows you to see things from a different perspective, to embrace vulnerability, to have humility, to have discipline, but also to really ache and hurt when others are in pain. And that's why you will see 70% of the world's health workforce is women. But only 25% of health leadership is women. So women are at the front line, giving care, not getting paid, not getting recognized, not getting education, and yet they persevere because faith in humanity, faith in their religious beliefs drives them on, as well as this ability to give in to the love you feel for other people. I think really another statistic before I go, I just want to let you know, it was very tragic because only 3% of the world's population work in health, but 16% of the deaths in the first 6 months were mainly women health workers. So, you know, this issue of societal views on women, men, the impoverished, the disadvantaged is something that is universal. And then we have to understand that faith is very universal, although it manifests in different ways. So I suppose that's what I've learned. You have to live into faith in order to be interfaith.
Thank you for just getting the ball rolling and talking about vulnerability and empathy. I think there was a shared theme that was there. So those are just to get us started. The next person I'd like to introduce is Elina. And she's the Reverend Dr. Elina Hellqvist Interim Director of the Office for Global Mission, Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland, and previously she has served as the Secretary for Interfaith Relations since 2011, and is very much part of the production of Interfaith Guide that I had the opportunity to follow its development. So all the way from Finland, tell us a bit more about what you see in this topic as a start.
Hello, everybody, and greetings from a very wintry Helsinki, Finland. It's late afternoon here, a cold winter day, -14, and lots of snow. First of all, it's a great honor to be here with you this afternoon. The other speakers said that during this time of pandemic, there's not necessarily need to have a look at the mirror, and I noticed that working from the home office since last March, I should take some time to also have a look on my bookshelf here at the home office. So greetings here from home. I come from a majority Lutheran country, so 2/3 of the population here are Lutherans, and only 1/3 is representing some other worldview, most of them non-religious. Most of our church members are, in fact, I would also say, not committed churchgoers, but rather church members from birth. And Finland is one of the lucky countries here at the corona time. We are a rather small country, which also helps with the pandemic. And as Debbie was referring to countries led by women, so we are also one of those countries led by women younger than I am. Our Prime Minister is almost 10 years younger than I am. And one rather sad or rather pessimistic thing that has happened over the past year is that we hear more than before also voices saying that, look, we are not doing well in this pandemic, and this is because we are led by women. And this is not true. We are actually doing very well if we have a look at the global scale. But there's lots of hate speech going on, and lots of also, I suppose, people are getting very tired on this pandemic, even though we had an easier summertime and we could see each other and even go to work in a rather normal way. Now people are really getting tired and waiting for the vaccines to come and so forth. And this related to Interfaith Dialogue. Interfaith Dialogue is also a fairly new thing, because we used to be such a majority Lutheran country for such a long time. So there has been interfaith engagement going on for decades, but for general public, I would say that became an opportunity some maybe 20, 30 years ago, and still in large parts of the country, it's really not an everyday issue to meet someone who represents a faith different than the one you grew up in. So here in Finland, we actually see more women involved in interfaith dialogue than in many other parts of the church life. I would say, for example, ecumenical movement and ecumenic seems to be more men's business, and interfaith seems to be more women's business, if we have a look at the numbers. And the one thing I would, for Sivin's introductory question, what is the insight I'd like to bring into this discussion is that sometimes it's easier to stand on equal footing when you are talking with people from another faith background than your own. So, well, you see, I'm a pastor in the Lutheran Church. We have had women pastors for 40 years, and I still meet people within my own church who have prejudices against women as pastors, but I haven't met one person from another faith community that wouldn't treat me as an equal person in a dialogue situation, even though their cultural background is not from a Scandinavian, very equal country. So this is one thing I've learned over the years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, because I think this is such an interesting point that is people from other faiths actually seem to recognize your presence more than those within. So the intra-religious conversation is very interesting as well. So I'd like to invite Debbie and Gaya to come back, as we have we're going to have an interesting conversation. And I'd like to invite our participants, the attendees. Please go ahead and place any questions you have, but probably just to get the ball rolling. And I'll start with Debbie, because I love the title of your book, and you identify yourself as a hopeful pessimist. And during this pandemic, and especially also with what we are reading the news these days, we seem to fluctuate between pessimism or optimism or hope, rather than hope. Could you share with us some of your experience, and especially in your interaction with women of different faiths?
Right.
How have they risen to the occasion, whether in Israel, Jerusalem, where you are, or around the world?
So my pessimism right now is not only because of this terrible pandemic that is affecting so many millions of people worldwide, but because we've seen in the last year a resurgence of anti-Semitism around the world, and of course, a continuation of other forms of racism and discrimination. But I'm also hopeful, and I have to say, I'm very happy that I'm now about 2.5 weeks after my second vaccination. So the one thing that I've been able to do in the last 2 weeks is hug some friends, which I couldn't do. And I live alone. It's very hard to go for 10.5 months without touching anybody. So at least I can do now. Other people who have been vaccinated twice, I'm happy to hug them. But the hopeful thing I want to say, I'm going to quote from a good friend who was at one point president of the Lutheran World Federation, former Bishop Munib Yunan. I'm sure many people know Munib. He's practically a neighbor of mine here in Jerusalem. And he said, as long as you believe in a living God, you must have hope. And I've sort of taken that as a motto. And I want to just mention very briefly something that happened this week, Sunday through Tuesday. It's Thursday now. So the first 3 days of this week, Bar Ilan University, one of the Israeli universities that's under Orthodox Jewish auspices, not ultra-Orthodox, but modern Orthodox, people like me, they sponsored a conference on feminism in the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. And of course, the conference was on Zoom, and I participated. And it was a very interesting conference. And in a way, it was easier than having an in-person conference, but you could have speakers and participants from all over the world. I'm sure it was cheaper for the organizers as well. But the thing that I want to mention is that I think that we have seen a lot of cooperation during this pandemic, largely done by women. And I appreciate what Gaya said about women in healthcare. And the one very positive effect that it's had on me personally is that I'm no longer a technophobe. And I've reconnected with many friends throughout the world, and of course, meeting new people through Zoom. Obviously, this privileges people who have computers or smartphones and who can use them. But I think that the use of computer technology is actually very widespread. And the people who are not affluent enough to have access to this kind of technology were not really involved in dialogue before either. And that's very unfortunate. It was unfortunate then and it's unfortunate now. And we have to enable them to have access. But I do think that now many, many more people will be able to dialogue with each other all over the world through the use of technology.
This is fascinating because on one hand, some of us might feel that there's a digital divide. This is the tension when it comes to the digitalization of dialogue in a sense. But we'll come back to you later, Debbie, and I have some questions, but there are also already some questions there, and it could be more related to Gaya or Elina. Any of you can jump in, but probably I've pointed to Gaya first because it does say that what are the key elements that women of different faiths could live in harmony with one another. And I guess that also ties in earlier with a question of, I think there was a question about, just what are the key elements that women of different faiths could live in harmony with one another? What do you see from your point of view?
Yeah, so my point of view is obviously shaped by Buddhism because it really is, for me, it places agency and power within myself to develop myself. But it's very much a compassion and compassion orientated thought process. Earlier you were talking about, okay, women can become pessimistic, they can become optimistic. I think for me, my understanding of the faith that I come from is that it's the whole point is not to go to extremes of emotions. So we are really happy, we have a vaccine, and then we are disappointed that we still have to stay in lockdown for at least a year and a half more. I mean, let me be honest, as a health expert, at least a year. So it's I as a Buddhist, but I think I as a woman as well, I'm able to find that equilibrium, to say, yes, okay, all right, we can take another deep breath and continue going, because it's not just about me and my inconvenience. And I think as women are socialized, we are often more. But I also want to actually, Reverend, tell you, this is not anti-men, because some of the greatest human beings in my life are men, I must tell you, including the boy I've brought up, I mean, he's grown up to be a great man. So I think one thing that actually leading from that women can do is to bring up their sons and daughters and influence their nieces and nephews and influence their communities, because women have that traditional role of spending time with the young, nurturing the young. And often the break in interfaith dialogue and this tribalism comes not because only men are going to war, but women are perpetuating these differences. So I think, we mustn't see women as passive and, everybody is, against them. No, women are perpetrators in all the conflicts that humans have. But we have this opportunity. I mean, I'm a woman of science. I'm a medical doctor. It took me till my late 40s to realize it is okay to allow my spiritual self to come to work. I hid it. And thanks to my own, Buddhist priest here, Halyali Vimalaratna, and he's the one who put me in touch with, this forum. I got the confidence to be a strong woman of science and also to be a woman of faith and compassion. And what happens to women is in the workplace, particularly, they are afraid of being seen as weak, as caregivers. So, and the role models of leadership were men, usually who came from the military in the 1940s and invaded the corporate sector. So we don't even have a role model for female leadership that is based on you being yourself and human and living according to your faith, whatever that may be, right? So I think that's something that's an obstacle for women, not just how people project on us, but how we project. We are limited. And it's very difficult for, particularly, I coach a lot of young men, it's very difficult from the way they look, the way they project themselves, they don't want to appear weak. And there is that leading to that question of power. So women have soft power in society and we need to use that, right? But that's not enough. It's not just on women. You talked about the digital divide. It's very real. in Africa, only 33% of men have access to broadband internet. And guess what percentage of women? Only 20%. So even in the discrepancy, women have less. Are women doing less? No, they're doing more. But so we have to look at power hierarchies that perpetuate not just cultures and discriminations men pose on women, but that women also perpetuate. So I think women have to also accept their responsibility to, find a way. And for women do this. We don't go to war usually. We usually talk to another woman. So interfaith dialogue, I totally agree. Absolutely, absolutely. A way to start off, and the competency it gives you to be a human being in the 21st century is you learn to understand before you seek to be understood. You learn to listen before you say, this is the way you should be. And I think it sounds so simple, but it's a simple skill that could switch the lever, the button, I don't know, whatever it is. So I'm going on a bit. I'm sorry, Reverend. I'm very passionate about this.
Oh, that's good. That's good. And you can interact with each other. You can disagree, agree, and I'm here to be a listener and to learn, like many of our participants.
Okay.
And there's an interesting question for you, Elina. You said that it's interesting that ecumenical relations seems to be the male-dominant field in your context. But interfaith is more majority of women are involved in interfaith dialogue. Is that true in all levels of the dialogue, including academic dialogues, more for theologians,
yes.
right to the practical?
Yeah. If I may continue just a few words from the previous question, and from more an everyday perspective, what helps, especially during this pandemic, is I suppose women have, I would say, a very practical attitude to everyday life. So the first question is, right, how are we going to handle this? So what's going to happen tomorrow? What do we do with the schools? How do we take care of the kids? And what are we going to eat? And how are the things organized? So, and I think this leads to what Peniel said right in the beginning, that interfaith dialogue has more or less, it's seen as an elitist action, more or less. And if I think about my own context, both ecumenical movement and interfaith dialogue from everyday level are seen more or less an elitist approach to life. But interfaith is a rather new area, and there the practicalities come in. So there are the practical everyday questions. Oh, right, we have this bunch of kids in the play school, and half of them, they come from a different background. So how are we going to handle this? And then the academic study comes a little bit later. But about the gender balance in the Finnish context, in academic level, we have both men and women on equal standing. But if we look at those who as representatives of their communities are there, I see more women on interfaith side and more men on the ecumenical side. This is only my observation, I would say.
Can I jump in? Can I say something?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
I really love that, because I totally agree women are practical. I'm absolutely practical. You want something done, you come to me, we get it done. But I think there's a flip side to that. There's a flip side to that, because we're still preoccupied being practical, cooking and cleaning and looking after children and being school teachers and nurses and so on, right? We forget that if we become value-based, which is what women of faith are, right? We can unleash the power of human in us, right? I'm not going to go into a theological discussion about anything else, but there is a power within us that is not unleashed because we are so preoccupied with practical things. So while that is a strength, it can also hold us back. So creating that consciousness to see what is the balance. How do I, look after my family, my community, my children, whatever, my staff, but at my patients, but at the same time, how can I find time and space to find what is so valuable to me that I will not violate under any condition? And these are your fundamental, they could be your religious beliefs, your values, I call them values much more, what line will I not cross? But women are so tired. They don't have time for this. That's probably why women are not at the big meetings of interfaith, economical discourse. I don't know. So I just, that thought came to me because I've seen it's a way of, if you like, keeping us out of the big discussion,
I can almost see that, Debbie, you're ready to jump in because you managed to get into these big discussions somehow. But also the question of power, I think, was interesting. But over to you. I sensed that you would have something to say over that.
I do attend meetings where I may be the only woman. And it's a little bit lonely sometimes. So I really welcome, and I hope that I also try to encourage other women, especially younger women, to get involved. What I wanted to say in response to something Gaya said earlier, I think it was talking about men and women. And, obviously we are partners, and both on a very personal level, but also in terms of promoting feminist change in the world. There have been some wonderful men who have been real pioneers in this area, and I think we have to recognize that. And I once wrote an article which I called Pride Without Prejudice. And obviously it's based on Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice, great book. Not comparing myself at all. She's a tremendously important author. But I just wrote that I think we have to take pride in who we are, each of us, who we are in our gender identity, in our religious, ethnic, cultural, linguistic, social, whatever it is, but without being prejudiced against the other person who has their own gender, culture, language, religion, etc., etc. And I think that there's been too much of an emphasis in the world on uniting people against an enemy. If we only have an enemy, then we'll be strong. We have to begin to think about how to be strong and how to have pride without in any way damaging the other. The other is another human being. And I could develop that further, but I think I'll stop now.
Yes, just to react to what Debbie just said, in other words, isn't that so that we are always competing with someone? So if somebody gets a louder voice, we are losing, and we want to try to always win and be a little bit better than the other. Do you see it that way, or did you mean something else?
No, I think that, first of all, there are, youth programs that have de-emphasized competitive sports and have emphasized the individual trying to do their best. And, whether it's running faster or jumping higher or whatever it is. I'm very unathletic, so I wouldn't get into that. But I think it's wonderful for people to develop all of their own talents and skills. And you know what? When they can collaborate and cooperate with others, they can develop their own skills even more. And so there are ways of trying to play down competition and winning and try to play up a very healthy kind of self-interest that doesn't in any way negate the self-interest of others.
Yes, and I think this relates to something that Gaia said just before about women being so preoccupied with everything that there's no time to kind of stop and think about the faith and value basis. And I think I at least see that these two are connected. So when you are very preoccupied of being best in all areas of life, you might lose yourself. There's no time to reflect. At least I can find myself in that situation quite often, trying to balance with, demanding job and family and all other things. So that really needs an effort to take the time to somehow nourish yourself and nourish your faith.
Can I just add maybe a very short piece here? I think that within our Jewish tradition, we have a wonderful gift, which I know that before the pandemic, I tried to share with as many people as possible. And that's the idea of Shabbat.
Mm.
And I'm suggesting to the whole world, I'm not in any way trying to make people Jewish, that Judaism is the religious culture of the Jewish people. And there are many other fine and wonderful and important religious cultures. But I do believe, especially in this highly technological society, that you need some time where you unplug and you're not at your computer, all your waking hours, and you spend time with your family and your friends, and you go for a walk and you read a book and you take a nap. And I think that that's very, very important. And one should never lose sight of one's own spiritual health.
And I found that interesting because nowadays we also hear a lot about mindfulness, and many would maybe connect that more with the Buddhist tradition. And this is more like a dialogue of spirituality. And I'm curious, Gaya, I could see you nodding. Perhaps you're ready to say something from that end when you heard Shabbat and drawing from our own religious resources.
Yes. So I think nobody has a copyright on any spiritual practice. Let's be honest, okay? We are humans, we own everything, we share everything, and we have progressed so much because we communicate and we share. If we remained in our little tribes of 150 people, we would never be where we are today. So let's really be honest. Let's step out of our religious cultural boxes, if you like, and that's what Interfaith Dialogue is about, to say, if you are human, there are tools available to you. Another culture may have found it, but that's okay. I think there's meditative practice, which can be reflective practice. It's really for developing your mind, your heart, to find that spirituality in you. And we call it meditation because Buddhism is a very old culture as well. And in fact, it's one of the three big things in Buddhism for a lay Buddhist, for an ordinary Buddhist, dana, sila, bhavana. What does that mean? Generosity. If you can't be religious or spiritual, just be generous. Give something to somebody, share something. So you can be there's a very easy staircase in Buddhism. Like you don't have to be religious, but you can be generous. Then you have to have morality. Morality is how you react with others, right? So please don't steal from others, don't kill others. It's like the 10 Commandments. It's exactly the same. The moral code is very similar in all of our faiths. But in Buddhism, there's a lot of emphasis given to self-reflection and self-development. And of course, when you practice this for thousands of years, you get a body of knowledge. And for me, the Buddha is a teacher. He taught for 45 years. There are 84,000 different pieces of teaching. And this is all about you dealing with yourself while being generous and kind to everybody else. I mean, this is in a nutshell for a lay person what it is. So I think it's amazing that meditation has taken off more broadly, but I think we shouldn't be dishonest and say, oh, only a certain religion owns it. But also the downside is it's being commercialized. It's been sold on this and that. And why we meditate is forgotten, but how to meditate is taught, right? So you can meditate, and if you meditate and you're still and you're reflective and you just pause, of course you will have a benefit. So that's what the how-to of it. And your health will benefit. There's research. Your brain changes, your health benefits, everything happens. But women of faith and people of faith will attach that to a purpose. Why am I doing this? And the why is what drives us as people, right? So I think that's the difference. I think meditation is very popular. It will help you physically. Maybe it'll help you with your relationships, right? But I think what faith brings to us is why are we doing this, not just what are we doing. So women of faith have, I think, an opportunity to say, how does this technique, because it's just a technique, serve me others around me, serve humanity. That's what this is about, I think. I think that's the difference between, blindly doing something. And I'm sure there are lots of non-Buddhists who are far better meditators than Buddhists, but that's not the point. But if you do it properly, it's very hard. Just to be silent for 10 seconds without letting your mind wander, right? And it's based on the conversation we had. Because we're so busy, if we can be quiet for a moment, then we regain that awareness and consciousness, and it's only from there you can develop. And so yes, I mean, it's great, it's hard, but remember the purpose.
I'd like to draw some questions here together, unless Elina, you want to say something to add on?
Just a quick comment on what Gaya was talking about meditation. We have a huge discussion on can Christian be a practitioner of mindfulness right now. And I suppose the difference is there, you said that to find yourself. I suppose from the Christian, also I suppose from Jewish perspective, the purpose would be rather to find God and hear what God is saying to you. But as you said, the technique is there, and then we give the meaning and the purpose for the practice. Just a comment.
Thank you. Now, moving a little bit from the more spirituality side, there was an interesting question on the role of reason, the cognitive side of dimension. And I want to combine it not just with the theological reflection, because Gaya, you earlier talked about a scientific reason as well. So I think this is a science and faith in the reflective mode, specifically for interfaith collaboration. Because some people might see that this interfaith dialogue is like a very just for nice people, for people who just want to be nice. It's not really tough in your thinking and really engaged. And this is a question open to all of you, whoever wants to speak first. And specifically related to COVID-19, because it really has exposed so many different sides of us, the best and the worst in our own thinking, whether it's disinformation or the way we respond to people who are different, with hate or suspicion. So I guess that's where I'm going, packing these two together. The cognitive dimension, the reasoning part, because people might say, oh, women is about empathy, it's about the heart, not the head. But I think all three of you would disagree with that, and so I leave it to you. Anyone can go first.
Yeah, let me say something. It seems to me that the three women panelists, we all have advanced degrees. We're all doctors of one thing or another. So that might indicate that there's some cognitive skill at work here. It's interesting because my field of research, my doctorate is in education. And my field was the social history of Jewish women's education, and which changed radically in the 20th century. Traditionally, some sources have suggested that women really don't have the cognitive skill to study Torah, our sacred text, which for male Jews was always one of the main ways they served God, not just prayer or ritual, but study. And then some of them said, well, women can't do that. So I'm happy to report that this has changed and that there are Jewish women all over the world who are serving God by studying our sacred texts on a daily or a weekly basis, however they can organize their lives. And obviously, a person should try to integrate their cognition and their emotions and their spirituality. And there may be some people who are more in one direction and some are more in another direction, but we all have all of the, and physical, the body. It's not just, the cognition and emotions and spirituality, it's also our physicality. So all of those things together. Now, I guess Gaya, as a woman of faith, but someone who doesn't define herself as a religious person in that sense, so she might not use the term God the way I would use it, and I guess Elina would use it. When you can combine all of those things within yourself, you can direct that to God. And many of us believe that God is both transcendent and immanent. And if God is immanent, that means God is within each and every one of us, as well as being out there, creator of heaven and earth, etc. So we can integrate these various aspects of our personality and our being to serve God.
So if I can just jump in, I think that's really beautifully said. Thank you, Debbie. If I go back to because this is an amazing era. Okay, so neuroscience has advanced so much in the last 20, 30 years. We've learned more in the last couple of decades about how our brain and mind, because work, than we've known for millennia. So now it's really, and we can see that it's partly biological, but it's often social conditioning. The brain is plastic, it changes. So if you keep generations of women and say, you're not smart enough, you can't learn, right? So those parts of their brain are not activated, right? I did not understand sexism until I arrived in Geneva, in international Geneva 20 years ago. I grew up in a middle-class Sri Lankan Buddhist home. I never thought I was less than any man. Nobody told me. I didn't think I was more than any man, but I didn't think I was less than any man, right? My 10 years in China, lots of people can criticize China, never felt sexism. I did not feel sexism, all right? I felt no limits as a woman, except, of course, as Debbie says, I can't run as fast as a man, I can't get into a fist fight, those things. But I was not minded to either. So we have to understand sometimes the reality we see is because it's been conditioned by society, right? And we have to unpack that as well. And I do not believe that most societies these days understand that women can achieve as well, but it's a social conditions that can hinder them. And science is revealing this. It is absolutely revealing this. Now, there are biological hormonal differences because emotions are related to neurochemicals, right? So there are some, so for example, when you have childbirth, when you have a child, an abundance of oxytocin is released. And that's really required so that you love your child and you protect it. Otherwise, this helpless thing will not survive. But then now I see 25 years after I had my children, right? I can reactivate that. So maybe women are, because of that trigger, able to reactivate it. And it's a beautiful, pleasant feeling. It's a feeling of unconditional love. But that is not to say all mothers feel that. So we mustn't say just because most feel it that all mothers, there are mothers who abandon their babies. There are mothers who have other problems that they're so preoccupied, right? So there were questions in the chat about domestic violence. Yes, 1 in 3 women experience intimate partner violence. These are women of faith, women without faith. I don't know. They are just human women, right? In COVID, it has gone up. It has gone up and women are trapped, right? So I think these are, and when you are trapped over a period of time in fear and abuse, your brain changes, your character changes, right? So it is not some static thing. So that's why I really am drawn to this idea in Buddhism that I have a great deal of what I experience in my life. If I think deeply enough, I have control over it. I have some agency over it, right? But how do you balance that with arrogance or pride, this false pride, right? That everything is because of what I do. So I think if you find that space, and if you are a person of faith, you will find that balance. I mean, human beings are so smart. If you are able to stop and think and interact with other people. So yeah, I mean, science is also a tool, I think, Reverend, too, for women and people of different faiths to talk, because we could understand, all of us understand science in a similar way, because it's a universal language that is becoming more and more accepted. But we mustn't split science from spirituality or faith either, right? Sometimes science is later than faith. Science reveals to us, like now neuroscience is revealing to us how the mind works. But a sage, the Buddha 2,600 years ago, actually very clearly explained what we're finding out now. So sometimes science is many centuries behind, but it could be the tool that allows us to speak between different faiths and to say, oh yeah, okay, I accept that, like I accept gravity. Gravity is the force that we are all experiencing. So really interesting. I mean, what a conversation.
May I bring in 2 other points, different points to the question Sivin just posed. First of all, somebody asked in the chat, how about the theological reflection on interfaith issues? And well, I come from a Lutheran church that's very preoccupied with rationality and theological statements and theological reflection, up to the point that I sometimes feel that we've lost the sight of that there's human below here also, not only head up. And if we approach interfaith from the perspective that we first have to solve all the theological problems, there wouldn't be enough days in our lives to do that. So something we need to kind of suffer when we do the interfaith dialogue, that we don't have all the theological answers yet. So we kind of have to bear with it, that those questions are not going to be solved, but we still need to be in touch and have a dialogue with each other. And that comes to what I can't remember, was it Debbie or Gaya who said something about us being a holistic person? So I suppose those kind of connect here. So in interfaith dialogue, you need to take up also your emotions and your everyday interaction, not only the theological mind going behind it. So that's the first point about theology of interfaith dialogue, or theology of religions, I would say. And the other thing about COVID and reflection and science, I think that one of the tasks of us who are religious leaders is to say, listen to people like Gaya who are medical doctors. And that's something that has had to be done also here in Finland, because now when everybody is staying in their little homes and just studying things from the internet, there's lots of also disinformation and fear and really, I don't like to use this word, but I have to use stupid ideas about vaccines and medications and how to protect ourselves and how to protect other people. So for example, our Archbishop gave a statement saying that, yes, you should take your vaccine when it's the time. So on these issues of COVID, I think it's for us theologians, we should also leave the space for you medical doctors to do your job and support you when you are doing it. Those 2 points of view still. Thank you.
I just have 2 sentences to add. One is that this is not only a crisis of physical health, this is a crisis of mental and social and economic health. And the second thing that I want to say is, I mentioned that I live alone. So I've had people who've said to me, oh, you're so unfortunate, it must be the worst having to be alone. And I always say, it's challenging, but I would much rather be alone than be together with an abusive partner. And what you said, Gaya, about the incidence of abuse, it has gone up tremendously in our country, I'm sure all over the world. And we're going to have to, the vaccine will help with our physical health, but we're going to have to do a lot of work to deal with some of these other issues.
I mean, it's compounding to that. In a way, the pandemic came when we were becoming more isolated, right, as societies. So, I mean, I come from a culture with extended families. My mother lives with me. I mean, she said she's going to live with me for her whole life. It's not a choice. She's going to stay with me. Okay. So, and that's accepted. That's accepted. That's fine. It's my duty. It's my pleasure, all of that. But a lot of mental health problems, as Debbie was saying, was also already growing, right? Even before the pandemic, about 1 in 10 people needed medication for mental health conditions. And I'm not talking about another 10, 20, 30% who actually were suffering, lonely, depressed, never get diagnosed, right? And while part of this is medical and chemical, and of course they require something, a lot of it can be seen in this social isolation that we have. The me individual, the right of the individual, I can decide on what I do. And also you see in the pandemic, even when we started saying, wear a mask. So people that were from more communal countries, they said, okay, because the message was clear. Even if it's not me, I'm protecting somebody else. But people if you take Western, rich, democratic political systems, they said, no, it's my right. It's my right not to wear it. So you see, we were already on this path to being isolated, right? And now somebody has forced isolation, lockdown, even more, and we're having a crisis of it. But this is a real problem, particularly for younger people. It's a real problem of the world. And if you ask, how can interfaith dialogue have an impact on the world? Maybe these are the questions also we need to talk about, because mental suffering is torture. You can't talk about it. Nobody appreciates it. So I think, now that we are suddenly forced, now we're thinking, okay, we understand loneliness now a little bit more. But again, if I take the faith-based view on it, for me, last year was the biggest year of my spiritual growth in my life, because I couldn't go out, I couldn't entertain, I couldn't do this. I stopped traveling, right? And luckily with the Buddhist community and the temple, the International Buddhist Foundation in Geneva, I convinced them to digitize Buddhism, in that we started Zoom calls, and our two priests, they just took to it. They're excellent, And so now, before we never had that, now we have a community that meet 3-4 times a week in different activities, meditation, discussion, support, right, counseling. I never had time for this. Maybe I would go and do this once or twice a year with my busy schedule. So I think, it has truly given me an appreciation for being quiet, alone. But because I have some tools, I'm able to do something useful for that kind of quiet time, instead of saying, oh, I miss so-and-so. I'm like Debbie. I'd rather be alone, thinking, positive thoughts in myself. Then you realize how many hours and relationships you wasted before the pandemic, things you would tolerate socially. It's wonderful in some sense.
And
Elina, go ahead.
just a quick comment on what Debbie said about mental problems and isolation. One thing is that the years are not as long for everybody. So if you think about younger people, for them a year and a half is a much longer time than for us adults. And well, my kids are still at the school age. So if you think that you're in a secondary school for 3 years, so a year and a half of that time goes under the conditions of pandemic. Although our kids are back in the school, luckily, hopefully they will stay in the school building. But even those spring months was such a long time for them. It's not a long time for us adults, or at least not as long as for the kids. So I think the younger generation is the one who's going to carry on the burden of this pandemic for the rest of their lives, more than us.
Thank you so much. And of course, we also didn't want this to be like we all agree on the same thing. I think there were moments that each of us have a different shade and different perspective, even amongst us, amongst the three of you at the very least. And I found that to be very interesting and enlightening. Now, I'd like to invite each of you perhaps to just give maybe a closing encouragement, a closing comment. You can relate to one of the questions if you like, just for like a 1-minute closing. There are a lot of very interesting questions. And even though we started off with women and interfaith engagement, I noticed that we actually branched out in a wide variety of topics that it's not just limited to women. Of course, that was the starting point for us. And actually just listening to all three of you, it also showed the balance of mind, heart, focus on body, the social, the political. In fact, this has been such a rich conversation for me personally, and I have been learning a lot. And of course, I know there must have been challenges too. Someone has mentioned that there are moments where there's a racial dimension that is brought in, where there may be resistance within women communities of women, that there are difficulties, to move forward. So There's a lot to talk about, and I invite the participants to keep your questions coming, even though we can't address all of them. At least we can compile them for future webinars, and do continue to send us your comments. So I'd like to invite, and perhaps I will just go backwards this time. So I will start with Elina, and then Gaya, and then let Debbie have the final word in a sense, because you started off. So each person to give us about 1 minute. What do you want to say to all of us as a closing today? Elina.
Thank you. I'll pick up a thought from the chat saying that how do we include also women who are in a minority position, or how do we deal with this divides also among women? So one idea that I'd like to bring on the table at the closing is that we shouldn't only think about women and men balance or age balance, but we should always have a look at how do we make sure that everybody has a voice, both in the society and also in our religious or faith community, but also in interfaith dialogue. And how do we make sure that we don't always invite the person we know already, or person we know that is educated enough to be on our table, or the person who speaks well enough our language. So how can we start to work on those barriers that hinder somebody from participation? And I think this COVID situation, at least in a very democratic Western Northern European country where I come from, the social divides are again growing. So we have to keep everybody on board. How to do it? I think we need the work of everybody here.
Thank you. Thank you, Elina. Gaya.
Thank you.
Closing comments from you.
Yes, what an honor and pleasure it has been, and really, I feel so grateful. I think my first message is to say we can and should shape the world going forward. This has been a shock, and it's been a shock for everybody at the same time. So we don't usually have this. We have a problem in one country or another, and women, we have to figure out how men and women together can address the world's big problems: inequity, poverty, climate change, gender, discrimination, violence, mental health, all of that, right? And we have to understand problems of society are addressed by men and women together, not by ourselves. I think the second is to decide how in the world we can do this. And women have some added advantages, and particularly women of faith have added advantages in the new world, because how things are created now is co-created through collaboration, through exchange, through conversation. It isn't knowledge flows from the expert to the novice. It's no longer like that. The millennials have changed the world, all right? That's not how people learn anymore. So we have to be humble, and we have to take part in the conversation and understand we can only contribute so much. And the third thing is, while we struggle with our basic needs, our security needs, we are busy, really all we all want is self-transcendence. Whether it's the way Debbie described it or the way I describe it. It is about self-transcendence, right? Reaching your full potential in all aspects of your life. So we need to grow competencies, time and space in ourselves, but also in the people we influence. Elina, your young children, for me, my kids are grown up, but maybe my co-workers, where I'm trying to integrate spirituality into leadership in a public organization. So I think, we have to do those three things. Is it difficult? Yes, but women have never shied away from complex things. So I have all hope. I am an optimist.
Thank you. And Debbie, the hopeful pessimist, or maybe you have a new way of describing yourself. We would love to hear your final words for us.
After the panel today, I'm more on the hopeful side, but in any case, I want to thank the organizers of this very stimulating conversation, and I want to thank my fellow panelists, and I hope we'll have some other opportunities in the future to continue our discussion. I want to put in a plug for the International Council of Christians and Jews. We normally have an international conference at the end of June, beginning of July. It's always in a different country, different cities, to give an opportunity for people to be near their homes, so we have usually in Europe, but sometimes in Latin America or in Australia, etc. This year, of course, it's going to be on Zoom. And the theme of the conference is, when this is all over, how do we want the world to be different? Mm. So that's very close to some of the things we were discussing here. And if you don't mind, I do have emails for some of you, and other people can send me your email. And as soon as we have the conference program ready, we're working on it now, we will send it out to you, and perhaps you can join us for a continuation of this conversation.
Thank you so much to our distinguished panelists, reflective, insightful, and at times provocative, getting us to think, challenging us, but also, broadening at least my perspective, and I'm sure for many who have participated. Now, of course, due to time, we couldn't have covered everything, but I think this is meant to get the conversation going and deepening it. Now, I would like to invite all the participants and attendees who are still here, who are engaged until this time, to please share with us at least one insight. Just give us some feedback to the panelists and share it to all the attendees if possible. Like, what is one insight that you found to be most significant for you, that really impacted you, that touched you? And I think that would be fantastic for the panelists to also get some feedback from you, and for us too as the organizers to learn from those of you who have joined us. Now, on behalf of the organizers, I like to, with Peniel from WCC, and also Elina, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland, and of course the Lutheran World Federation, we would like to just thank all three of you for spending this time with us, and to also broaden our perspectives, not just from a theological side, but also scientific input, spirituality. There's also the core question of being holistic, and I was quite amused when Debbie said it's okay to be alone. And indeed, there are times that it's fine to be alone, and there are times that we need to be with people. And I guess this is the kind of tension that we try to live with. And there are also questions of mental health, a very rich conversation, and we will have this available online so people can revisit the thoughts. And I will also send a follow-up email to all those who have registered with relevant links that our panelists may recommend for them to have further reading and learning. So I just want to thank all three of you once again, and I also thank Peniel for your opening remarks. Would you like to say anything? Just a few words, because you have been quite silent.
Just to come back and remind us that very often we think that religions are fortresses to be defended, whereas in fact they are wellsprings for the flourishing of life. And therefore the challenge is on each one of us to be a channel of this life-giving waters to everybody around. And I wish you all the best as we become channels of justice, equality, and peace in the world today.
Thank you very much. And so I will be leaving the chat open a little bit for our participants to give us some comments. So once again, thank you very much for joining us in this webinar, and we look forward to have another one in the future so that we can benefit from more engagement with not only our panelists, perhaps others in this topic and beyond. So once again, thank you, Debbie, for joining us. Thank you, Elina, and also thank you, Gaya, as well, for this time. And thank you, Peniel, for your closing remarks.